An original podcast from podlatino.com.
Some years simply pass. Others change everything. 1989 was the second kind. Not because of any single event, but because throughout those 12 months, several ruptures happened at the same time: geopolitical, human, technological, cultural. When it was over, the world looked nothing like it had at the start. And almost everyone, in one way or another, felt it. The 1980s had unfolded under the long shadow of the Cold War. Two blocks, two systems, two visions of the world watching each other with permanent suspicion and nuclear arsenals capable of destroying everything several times over. But toward the end of the decade, that structure had started showing cracks. Not suddenly, but through accumulation. Debt, inefficiency, social unrest, reforms that never went far enough. In 1989, the cracks became fractures. The first visible movement came from Poland. The Solidarity trade union, founded at the start of the decade and repressed for years, had managed to force negotiations with the communist government. In June of 1989, partially free elections were held, the first in decades. Solidarity swept every seat it was allowed to contest. The result sent an unmistakable message: the regime had lost its legitimacy. By August, Poland had its first non-communist prime minister in decades. It was not an armed revolution. It was the weight of popular will, built up over years, finally finding a crack wide enough to push through. Hungary did something that had seemed unthinkable. It began dismantling the barbed wire fence, separating it from Austria. In May of 1989, the first sections of the Iron Curtain on Hungarian soil started coming down, literally, with machines and wire cutters. That opened a physical door to the Western world. Thousands of East German citizens who had traveled to Hungary on vacation took advantage of that opening to escape westward. The internal logic of the system began collapsing from the inside. In East Germany, protests grew throughout the autumn. Cities like Leipzig saw tens of thousands of people taking to the streets with candles, in marches that became weekly rituals. The government tried to maneuver, announced reforms, replaced its longtime leader. Nothing was enough. On November 9th, during a chaotic press conference, an official announced that East German citizens were free to cross the border. The news spread within hours. That night, thousands of people approached the checkpoints in Berlin. Guards, without clear instructions, let them through. People began crossing in both directions, and some started hammering at the wall with pickaxes and chisels. The Berlin Wall had been built in 1961, not to protect the city, but to stop citizens from the east from escaping to the west. It was a border that divided families, streets, and a single city into two completely different worlds. For nearly 3 decades, it had stood as the most visible symbol of a planet split in half. Its fall was not an act of war or a diplomatic agreement. It was a night when people simply overwhelmed it. Few images from the 20th century carry the same emotional and political weight as that night in Berlin. The wave kept moving. In Czechoslovakia, protests that began in November grew with remarkable speed. The communist government tried to hold on, and there was initial repression. But the pressure never let up. In less than 6 weeks, the regime collapsed without firing a single shot. Parliament elected Václav Havel as president, a playwright and dissident who had spent years in prison for opposing the system. The Velvet Revolution, as it came to be known, showed that change could happen without violence, though it also required decades of quiet resistance to make a moment like that possible. Romania was different. Nicolae Ceaușescu's regime did not give way the same way. Protests broke out in the city of Timișoara, and spread across the country. The army was ordered to shoot. People died. But within days, the situation reversed itself. Parts of the military switched sides, power disintegrated, and Ceaușescu tried to flee. He was captured, tried in a summary proceeding, and executed on Christmas Day alongside his wife. The fall of communism in Romania was the most violent of all, and it left wounds that took a long time to heal. While Eastern Europe was transforming itself, the Soviet Union watched from the outside. Gorbachev, who had spent 4 years trying to reform the system without destroying it, did not intervene. That decision in itself was historic. In earlier years, the Soviet Union had crushed similar movements. In 1989, it did not. Also that year, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was completed, after nearly a decade of fighting with no decisive outcome. The war had been costly in lives, in resources, and in reputation. The return of the troops was one more sign of a power pulling back. On the other side of the world, in China, 1989 told a completely different story. In the spring, students and workers began gathering in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, calling for political reform and greater openness. For weeks, the square became a symbol of hope. The government declared martial law. In the early hours of June 3rd to 4th, the army moved in with tanks and troops. What followed was a violent crackdown whose exact death toll was never officially confirmed. The image of a lone man standing in front of a column of tanks traveled around the world. China chose the opposite path from Eastern Europe, maintained political control at any cost while gradually opening the economy. That decision would shape the following decades in ways no one could clearly predict at the time. In March of 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground off the coast of Alaska and spilled millions of liters of crude oil into Prince William Sound. It was one of the largest environmental disasters in history up to that point. Images of oil-soaked birds and devastated coastlines sparked a global reaction. It was not the starting point of the environmental movement, which already existed, but it accelerated conversations about the fragility of the natural world and the responsibility of extractive industries. The world was beginning to reckon with the idea that economic growth came with costs that did not always show up on a balance sheet. That same year, at the CERN laboratories in Switzerland, a British physicist named Tim Berners-Lee submitted a proposal to his supervisors. He called it the World Wide Web. It was a system for linking documents and information across computer networks. At the time, few people grasped what it meant. His supervisors added a note in the margin that described it as interesting but vague. What Berners-Lee had in mind was the architecture of what we now use as the Internet every single day. It was not yet a reality accessible to the public, just a technical proposal. But the seed had been planted. Nintendo launched the Game Boy in Japan in April of 1989, and in the rest of the world shortly after. A small handheld console with a grayscale screen and a battery that lasted for hours. The first cartridges included Tetris, the game that hooked an entire generation regardless of age, language, or culture. The Game Boy was not the first portable gaming device, but it was the one that defined the concept for millions of people. In hindsight, it was an early step toward a world where carrying a screen in your pocket would become completely ordinary. The pop culture of 1989 closed out the decade with images that are still alive today. Batman, Tim Burton's version with Michael Keaton, became a global phenomenon and proved that superheroes could work in a dark and adult register. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade sent Harrison Ford and Sean Connery across half of Europe in search of the Holy Grail. Dead Poets Society, with Robin Williams, turned a story about poetry and teenage rebellion into a generational statement. The Little Mermaid relaunched Disney animation after years of uneven results. In music, Madonna and Janet Jackson dominated the charts and the airwaves. Television, video rental stores, and audiovisual culture were expanding at full speed. In January of 1989, Salvador Dali died. The surrealist painter who had bent reality with images no one else had ever imagined was 84 years old. His death was the farewell of a figure who had moved through much of the 20th century with an originality that never made concessions. Symbolically, it was also a final goodbye to an artistic era the century had cultivated with intensity. 1989 ended the way it had begun, with the world in motion and the certainties of the past in retreat. Some walls came down loudly and visibly, like the one in Berlin. Others began to crack quietly, like the ones separating the world from the technology that was coming. That year held both the end of something that had seemed permanent and the beginning of something that did not yet have a clear name. The Cold War had not formally ended, but its logic had begun to unravel. The 20th century still had a decade ahead of it, but the world taking shape could no longer be understood by the old rules. That is the kind of year that does not get forgotten.